For many Americans, the cost of living crisis is not something abstract. It is not a headline, a chart, or an economic forecast. It shows up in a familiar place, at a familiar moment, every single week. It shows up at the grocery store. Food has become the clearest and most immediate pressure point in household finances. Long before people miss rent payments or fall behind on bills, they feel it in their grocery carts. The total at checkout keeps climbing, even when inflation is said to be slowing, even when wages appear to be rising. Something does not add up. This is not just a story about higher prices. It is a story about how groceries, an expense that cannot be delayed or avoided, are reshaping daily decisions, financial stability, and quality of life. From subtle changes in pricing to deeper structural forces in the market, the rising cost of food is doing more than squeezing budgets. It is changing how Americans live, eat, and plan for the future. To understand why the cost of living feels so heavy right now, you have to start with groceries. Not as a symptom, but as a driver. Because when the price of feeding a household becomes unpredictable, unaffordable, and inescapable, the crisis is no longer theoretical. It becomes personal. There is a reason grocery prices feel heavier than almost any other expense in American life. When the price of electronics goes up, people delay upgrades. When car payments rise, buyers wait, downsize, or turn to the used market. Even housing, as painful as it is, comes with options like moving, sharing space, or renegotiating terms. Groceries offer none of those choices. Food is not optional, and it cannot be postponed. In the United States, groceries are one of the few expenses that households must face on a fixed, repeating schedule. Every week, families return to the same checkout line, regardless of what else has changed in their financial situation. Entertainment can be cut. Subscriptions can be canceled. Travel can be postponed. Lifestyle can be downgraded. But the grocery bill arrives again and again, with no realistic way to skip it. This is why even small increases in food prices feel unusually large. A few extra dollars on chicken, milk, or eggs may not seem dramatic on paper, but they hit a part of the budget that has no flexibility. Unlike discretionary spending, grocery costs do not compete with wants. They compete with survival. When prices rise in a category that cannot be avoided, the pressure builds faster and feels more personal. For many American households, groceries are also the first place where financial stress becomes visible. Before missed rent payments or credit card defaults, people notice it at the store. The cart looks the same, but the total is higher. Or the total stays the same, but the cart is lighter. Either way, something feels wrong. This moment often arrives even when official inflation numbers suggest prices are cooling. That disconnect matters. On paper, inflation may appear under control. In reality, grocery prices operate on a different timeline. Once they rise, they rarely return to previous levels. Because food is non-negotiable, households absorb the increase immediately. There is no waiting period, no adjustment phase, and no buffer. The cost of living feels higher long before the data confirms it. This is why groceries are not just another line item in the budget. They act as a trigger. They are the first expense to break the sense of financial stability, and the first signal that everyday life is becoming harder to afford. When people say the cost of living is rising, they are often not talking about abstract economic indicators. They are talking about the moment they realize that feeding their household now takes more money, more planning, and more sacrifice than it did before. In that sense, grocery prices are not merely an indicator of economic stress. They are the starting point. They translate broad economic shifts into a weekly, unavoidable experience. And because food cannot be delayed, downsized beyond a certain point, or negotiated away, groceries are often the first expense to break budgets and the first reason the cost of living crisis becomes impossible to ignore. On paper, food inflation in the United States appears to be slowing. Annual numbers show smaller increases than before. Headlines use words like cooling and stabilizing. From a distance, it can look like the worst has passed. But for many households, that narrative collapses the moment they reach the checkout line. Weekly grocery spending continues to rise, even as official inflation rates suggest improvement. The total at the register feels higher, not lower. In many cases, families are buying fewer items, smaller quantities, or lower quality substitutes, yet paying roughly the same or more than they did before. This gap between the data and the lived experience creates confusion and frustration. People are told prices are improving, but their budgets tell a different story. The problem is not the year-over-year percentage. The problem is the base. Grocery prices climbed sharply over a short period, and once they reached that higher level, they stayed there. A slowdown in inflation does not mean prices are coming down. It simply means they are rising more slowly from an already elevated starting point. For households, that distinction offers little relief. This is why grocery inflation feels different from other forms of price pressure. When prices rise and then fall, consumers feel temporary strain followed by recovery. With food, that recovery rarely happens. Prices move upward, settle, and become the new normal. Over time, that pattern creates a ratchet effect. Each increase locks in, making the cost of everyday life permanently higher. At the store level, this effect is amplified. Shrinking package sizes, subtle product changes, and quiet adjustments allow prices to remain high without drawing immediate attention. Consumers sense something is off, even if they cannot always point to a single item or price tag. The experience becomes cumulative, building week after week, receipt after receipt. As a result, the cost of living does not feel cyclical or temporary, it feels structural. Even when inflation headlines improve, grocery prices continue to shape household decisions in lasting ways. People adjust expectations downward, plan more carefully, and accept that their money no longer goes as far as it once did. The feeling is not that prices are stabilizing, but that a higher cost of living has settled in for good. This is the disconnect at the center of the grocery crisis. The numbers suggest relief is coming. The checkout line suggests it already passed them by. And when everyday necessities remain expensive long after inflation slows, the cost of living stops feeling like a phase and starts feeling like a permanent condition. When people talk about rising grocery costs, most of the attention goes to price tags. Shoppers scan the shelf, compare numbers, and look for discounts. But one of the most powerful drivers of higher living costs is far less visible. It does not always show up as a price increase. It shows up as less. Shrinkflation works by keeping the package and the branding familiar while quietly changing what is inside. To the consumer, it feels like nothing has changed until it adds up. Technically, shrinkflation is not classified as inflation. The sticker price stays put, so it does not trigger the same alarms. But the real cost per unit recess, each ounce, each serving, each meal becomes more expensive, even though the number on the shelf looks stable. For households trying to manage a budget, this distinction matters more than the definition. The impact shows up over time. Families find themselves buying groceries more often. Items that used to last a week now run out in 5 days. Staples need to be replaced sooner. Monthly spending increases, not because people are consuming more, but because the same consumption now costs more to maintain. This makes budgeting increasingly difficult. A household may plan based on past spending, only to realize that the same routine no longer fits within the same budget. What makes shrinkflation especially damaging is how quietly it reshapes expectations. Consumers adjust without fully realizing why. They accept smaller portions as normal. They stretch meals thinner. They make trade-offs that feel personal, even though the cause is structural. Over time, the higher cost of living becomes normalized, not because prices exploded overnight, but because value slowly disappeared. This is how the cost of living can rise without looking like it is rising. Shrinkflation hides the pressure in plain sight. It avoids headlines, avoids clear numbers, and avoids public debate. But for households paying attention to their receipts and their routines, the effect is undeniable. Less product, more frequent purchases, and a steady drain on budgets that feels invisible but never stops. The most common explanation for high grocery prices is simple and familiar. Supply chains were disrupted, transportation became more expensive, labor costs increased. According to this narrative, higher prices are merely the unavoidable result of higher costs. But this explanation only tells part of the story. The structure of the grocery industry in the United States matters just as much as the inputs. Over time, food retail has become highly concentrated. A small number of large chains control a significant share of the market, especially in urban and suburban areas. For many households, there are only one or two realistic options for where to shop. That concentration changes how prices behave. In a competitive market, rising costs are often followed by price competition once conditions stabilize. Companies look for ways to win customers back through lower prices or better value. But when market power is concentrated, that pressure weakens. Large grocery chains do not need to aggressively cut prices if consumers have limited alternatives and food remains a necessity. Once shoppers adjust to higher prices, a critical shift occurs. The urgency to bring prices back down fades. Margins that expanded during periods of disruption become easier to defend. Temporary price increases quietly turn into permanent ones. What began as a response to external shocks becomes a new baseline. This is why grocery prices often feel sticky. They rise quickly during crises but come down slowly, if at all. The issue is not just the cost of producing or transporting food. It is the ability of dominant players to maintain higher prices without losing enough customers to force change. In this environment, price discipline favors the seller, not the consumer. Calling this a free market misses an important detail. Choice exists on paper, but leverage does not. When access to food is controlled by a small number of powerful retailers, pricing reflects not only costs, but control. Grocery prices stop being a transparent signal of economic conditions and start becoming a reflection of who holds the power in the transaction. For households, the result is the same. Prices remain elevated long after the original justifications fade. The cost of living adjusts upward and stays there, not because food suddenly became permanently more expensive to produce, but because the market allows those prices to hold. What looks like inflation is often something more structural. Pricing power quietly reshaping everyday life. For most of modern American life, credit was reserved for large purchases. Homes, cars, appliances, and occasional emergencies were the kinds of expenses people financed over time. Groceries were different. Food was something you paid for upfront, week by week, with cash or a debit card. That distinction mattered because it kept everyday survival separate from long-term debt. That boundary is now eroding. Buy now, pay later services, once associated with discretionary spending, are increasingly being used for basic necessities. Groceries, household staples, and everyday food purchases are now being split into installments. What used to be a routine weekly expense is quietly becoming a deferred obligation. This shift is more than a change in payment methods. It is a signal of financial strain. When households begin financing food, it suggests that grocery costs are no longer fitting within normal cash flow. The issue is not convenience. It is affordability. Food is being pushed out of the category of manageable expenses and into the category of financial burden. The long-term effects are subtle but serious. Paying later does not reduce the cost of groceries. It spreads the pressure forward. Each week's bill follows the next, stacking obligations on top of each other. Over time, this creates food debt, a concept that would have seemed extreme not long ago. Households find themselves starting each month already behind, using future income to cover past meals. This dynamic accelerates the paycheck-to-paycheck cycle. Income arrives already spoken for, not by large purchases, but by groceries that have been consumed and financed. The margin for error shrinks. Unexpected expenses become harder to absorb. Financial stress becomes constant, not because spending is reckless, but because basic needs no longer align with income timing. In this environment, the cost of living crisis changes form. It stops being only about rising prices and becomes a cash flow problem. The question is no longer whether households can afford food in theory, but whether they can afford it right now. When feeding a family requires borrowing from the future, the system has shifted in a fundamental way. Turning groceries into debt reshapes how people experience everyday life. It adds interest, penalties, and long-term consequences to something that used to be immediate and contained. And once food enters the credit system, the cost of living is no longer just higher. It becomes harder to escape. In many American cities, the grocery store no longer feels like a simple place to buy food. Everyday items are locked behind plastic cases. Shoppers wait for employees to unlock shelves. Security guards are visible at entrances and exits. What was once routine has become tense and inconvenient. These changes are often explained as a response to rising theft. Retailers point to organized shoplifting and higher loss rates as justification for tighter controls. But theft is only one part of the story. What matters more is how the response to it reshapes the cost of living. Locked aisles and increased security come with real expenses. More staff are needed. Surveillance systems must be installed and maintained. Store layouts are redesigned, slowing down shopping and increasing labor time. All of this raises operational costs, even before a single item is sold. Those costs are not absorbed quietly by retailers. They are passed on. Higher prices, reduced discounts, and tighter margins show up at the checkout line. Consumers pay not only for the food itself, but for the systems built around protecting it. The shopping experience becomes worse while the bill becomes higher. The friction matters. Longer waits, fewer accessible products, and a sense of suspicion change how people shop. Customers may leave without buying everything they intended, only to return sooner for another trip. This increases frequency, not efficiency, and pushes spending upward over time. A feedback loop begins to form. As prices rise, financial pressure increases. Higher pressure can lead to more theft. More theft justifies more security. More security raises costs, which are passed back to consumers through higher prices. Each turn of the cycle reinforces the next. For households, the result is a grocerying environment that feels both more expensive and more hostile. The cost of living rises not only through prices, but through time, stress, and inconvenience. What should be a basic errand becomes a reminder of economic strain. This is how everyday insecurity becomes embedded in the grocery system. The store reflects broader social and economic tension, and the costs of managing that tension land squarely on the consumer. The food itself has not changed, but the price of accessing it keeps climbing, one locked aisle at a time. For a long time, grocery prices followed a familiar logic. An item had a price, and that price stayed relatively stable from one visit to the next. Households learned what things cost, built routines around them, and planned accordingly. That predictability was an important part of managing everyday expenses. That stability is fading. Modern pricing systems increasingly rely on real-time data. Demand levels, store location, time of day, and purchasing patterns all feed into how prices are set. In theory, this allows retailers to respond quickly to market conditions. In practice, it makes grocery costs harder for consumers to anticipate. 2 trips to the same store can now produce different totals, even when buying similar items. Prices shift quietly, without clear explanation. What was affordable last week may feel expensive the next for households trying to budget carefully. This variability introduces constant uncertainty. Unpredictability is a cost of its own. Budgeting depends on consistency. When prices fluctuate, planning breaks down. Consumers lose the ability to estimate weekly spending with confidence. Small miscalculations compound, especially for households already operating with thin margins. This erosion of predictability also changes the psychological experience of shopping. People stop feeling in control of their expenses. Decisions become reactive rather than planned. Shoppers second-guess purchases, delay restocking, or make trade-offs on the fly. Not because their needs changed, but because prices did. Over time, this uncertainty reshapes the meaning of the cost of living. It is no longer defined solely by how expensive things are, but by how unstable they feel. Even moderate prices can create stress when they cannot be anticipated. Households adjust not only their spending, but their expectations, assuming volatility as the new normal. Dynamic pricing turns everyday necessities into moving targets. Food becomes something you cannot reliably plan around, even when income stays the same. And when the cost of feeding a household becomes unpredictable, the cost of living stops being a fixed challenge and becomes an ongoing source of anxiety.